The pen felt like it weighed a ton in Mr. Lino's hand. He held it loosely, his knuckles white, the tip hovering millimeters from the paper. The sheet, a white so bright it hurt his eyes, contained lines of fine print that danced before him, but it wasn't the content that paralyzed him. It was the empty space at the end, the dotted line that awaited his signature, like a sentence. Across the kitchen table, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with an anxiety that gripped his chest, a familiar feeling that visited him every morning but which today felt unbearable. His eyes, clouded by age, didn't focus on the words, but on the wall clock, whose hands moved with agonizing slowness. His daughter-in-law, Sandra, entered the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. She wore a neatly ironed floral dress and a smile that never reached her eyes. They were attentive, calculating eyes, which now rested on his hesitation. With a gesture intended to be affectionate, she placed her hand on his shoulder, but the touch was firm, a silent reminder of her presence and her expectation. "Come on, father-in-law, just sign it. Tiago is about to leave for school, and he can take it to the notary for us," she said, her voice as soft as velvet, but with a thread of impatience that only Lino could perceive. He didn't answer, just swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that hand like an anchor. Tiago appeared at the kitchen door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and headphones hanging around his neck. He was a skinny, slightly awkward 15-year-old, but with a gaze that seemed to capture everything around him. He saw the scene, his grandfather frozen, his mother's hand on his shoulder, and frowned. A silent alarm went off inside him, the same one that always rang whenever he heard his mother use that overly sweet tone of voice with his grandfather. He walked to the coffee maker, feigning indifference, and poured himself a cup, watching the two from the corner of his eye. The silence in the kitchen was thick, charged with a tension he could feel physically. "Morning, Grandpa." Tiago's voice cut through the air, making Sandra startle and remove her hand from Lino's shoulder. The old man blinked, as if waking from a trance, and a small relieved smile appeared on his lips upon seeing his grandson. "Good morning, my boy." The reply was low, almost a whisper, but firm. Tiago leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. "Mom, Grandpa needs his glasses to read these boring papers. Doesn't he? Where are they?" The question was casual, but it carried a purpose. Sandra forced a smile. "Oh, you know how he is. He left them somewhere again. We'll look for them later." Lino felt a pang of shame. Could it be true? He didn't remember getting up from his chair since he had woken up. His memory, once so sharp, now seemed like a tangle of loose threads. He spent his days trying to cling to certainties, but they slipped through his fingers. Sandra was efficient. She took care of the house, his medications, everything. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was just being stubborn, making things difficult for everyone. The idea of being a burden was what haunted him most, a cold fear that settled in his chest during the long, sleepless nights. He sighed, the heavy sound revealing the defeat he felt inside. Tiago, however, had seen the glasses. Earlier, when he woke up, he had passed through the hallway and seen the black case on the telephone table, next to a vase. He knew his grandfather always left them there before bed. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was a habit. Seeing his mother deny their existence so naturally made his stomach churn. He finished his coffee in one gulp and placed the cup in the sink, with a little more force than necessary. "I'll get them for him," he said, his voice dry. He left the kitchen without waiting for a reply, feeling his mother's irritated gaze burning into his back. When Tiago returned, extending the black case to his grandfather, the relief on Lino's face was visible. It was more than just getting his glasses back. It was the small validation that he wasn't crazy. He put them on, and the world around him gained sharper outlines. The letters on the paper, however, continued to be an intimidating blur. Sandra watched the scene with her arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. Her son's intervention had broken her momentum, and she needed to recalculate her approach. That document needed to be signed today, before her husband, Tiago's father, got home from work and started asking questions. "Leave that for later, Grandpa," Tiago said, gently taking the paper from the table and folding it. "Let's go outside and look at the plants. I think the orchid has a new bud." He smiled, a genuine invitation to escape that suffocating atmosphere. Lino nodded, grateful for the truce. Sandra didn't object. She knew that forcing the situation now would be a mistake. She would let him relax. Later, after lunch, when he was sleepy and more vulnerable, she would try again. Patience was a weapon, and she was a master at using it. The morning sun was mild, and the small backyard was Lino's refuge. He and Tiago walked slowly among the pots of ferns and violets. The old man ran his wrinkled fingers over the leaves, a gesture that connected him to the time of his late wife, who had loved that garden. She would have liked to see this one, Lino said, pointing to the small purple bud on the orchid. The mention of his grandmother brought a layer of complicity and longing that only the two of them shared. In those moments, Lino was not a confused old man, but the grandfather who had taught Tiago how to fly a kite and recognize bird songs. Yes, she would have, Tiago replied, placing a hand on his grandfather's shoulder, a light, supportive touch completely different from his mother's. "Grandpa, what is that paper? Why does Mom want you to sign it so badly?" The question came out unplanned, born from a worry. He could no longer hide. Lino stopped walking and looked at his grandson. There was a deep fear in his eyes, the vulnerability of someone who feels cornered. "She says it's to take care of my things, the bank, my pension. She says I don't have the mind for it anymore." His voice broke on the last sentence. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with immense sadness. Tiago felt a helpless anger grow inside him. He saw his grandfather every day. He knew he read the newspaper from cover to cover, commented on the news with lucidity, and still solved the most difficult crossword puzzles. He might be forgetful at times, a little slower, but he was not incapable. The narrative his mother was building, that of a senile man in need of guardianship, suddenly seemed cruel and dishonest. He wanted to say all this, but he knew it would only create a bigger conflict. Instead, he chose the path of affection. "Your mind is better than most, Grandpa," he said with disarming sincerity. "Remember last week when you explained that history lesson to me that not even the teacher could get right?" Lino managed a faint smile, a good memory amidst the day's anxiety. His grandson's praise was like a balm. For a moment, he felt strong again, the man he had always been. They stood in silence for a while, just looking at the garden, and that small exchange of words strengthened a bond that Sandra, with all her strategy, could not break. The truce lasted until lunchtime. The food, prepared by Sandra, was delicious as always, but the mood at the table was heavy. Tiago's father, Marcos, called to say he would have lunch at work and would only be back late in the afternoon. The news seemed to give Sandra a new wave of confidence. Lino ate slowly, pushing the food from one side of his plate to the other. His thoughts returned to the conversation with Tiago in the garden. The strength he had felt was draining away with every minute spent under his daughter-in-law's watchful eye. He felt like a mouse in a maze, with all exits controlled by her. After clearing the table, Sandra returned with a cup of chamomile tea. "For you to relax a little, father-in-law," she said, placing the cup in front of him. Alongside it, she once again placed the folded paper and the pen. The morning's performance was beginning again. "Now that we're calm, we can sort this out. It's just one signature. 1 minute." Tiago, who was in the living room, heard the movement and returned to the kitchen, stopping in the doorway. His body tensed. He became a silent witness, and his presence there seemed to be the only thing keeping his grandfather from completely giving in. Lino looked at the tea, then at the paper. The chamomile, which was supposed to be calming, felt like part of the trap, a sedative for his will. He felt tired, an exhaustion that wasn't physical, but emotional. To fight required an energy he no longer possessed. Maybe it was easier to just sign, to end it, to have some peace. His fingers moved toward the pen, his surrender almost complete. He just wanted the day to be over, for the pressure to go away. He raised his eyes and met his grandson's gaze, standing at the door. There was a silent plea in Tiago's eyes, a request that he not give up on himself. That look was enough. Lino pulled his hand back. "Not now, Sandra. I'm tired. I want to lie down for a bit." His voice was low but firm. The refusal, for the second time that day, shattered Sandra's facade. A thin vein pulsed on her forehead and her lips tightened into a white line. She said nothing, just gathered the paper and pen with abrupt movements, her contained anger emanating from every gesture. She left the kitchen, slamming a cabinet door, a sound that echoed the end of her patience. Tiago breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew the battle was far from over. Lino went to his room and lay down, but he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. Sandra's insistence, the way she treated him as if his mind were an abandoned house, and Tiago's look, full of a faith he himself was losing. Doubt gnawed at him. What if Sandra was right? What if his refusal to sign was just the last spasm of foolish pride, harming everyone? He felt profoundly alone, trapped between his daughter-in-law's manipulation and his grandson's worried love. The house, once his safe harbor, now felt like enemy territory. In the living room, Sandra paced back and forth, the phone to her ear. She spoke quietly, but the urgency in her voice was palpable. Tiago, pretending to be focused on a game on his phone, listened intently. No, he hasn't signed yet. I don't know Marcos. He's more stubborn than ever. Tiago is by his side all the time. It's like he's putting things in his grandfather's head. A pause. I know the money is running out. You don't have to remind me. That's why I need the power of attorney to solve that thing. Today. The term power of attorney confirmed Tiago's suspicions. It wasn't just any paper. It was about control and about money. The mention of money made Tiago's stomach drop. He had always known their financial situation wasn't the best since his father lost his old job, but he never imagined it involved his grandfather's pension. His mother's urgency now took on a darker shade. It wasn't just about making life easier, as she claimed. There was a desperation behind her actions, a motive that made her more dangerous. He turned off his phone and sat quietly processing the information. The affection he felt for his mother was now mixed with a painful mistrust. Meanwhile, Sandra hung up the phone and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She ran a hand over her face, the mask of calm slowly reforming. She looked toward the hallway at her father-in-law's room and her eyes hardened. She would not give up. There were bills to pay, a lifestyle to maintain. His pension money, combined with the sale of a small plot of land still in the old man's name, was the only short-term solution. It was for the good of everyone, she repeated to herself, like a mantra to justify what she was doing. His stubbornness was just an obstacle to be overcome. A tense calm settled over the house during the afternoon. Lino remained in his room, claiming a headache, but in reality, he was just seeking a truce. Tiago locked himself in his, the conversation he'd overheard echoing in his mind. He felt like an accomplice to a secret, an observer of an injustice unfolding under his own roof. The love he felt for his grandfather compelled him to act, but the fear of confronting his own mother paralyzed him. How could he accuse her of something so serious without concrete proof? It would be his word against hers. He knew who his father would choose to believe. Sandra used the silence to put her next plan into action. She went to the living room and deliberately changed the television channel to a loud news station, different from the documentary channel Lino always watched. Then, she hid the remote control under a sofa cushion. It was a small act of sabotage, another piece she would use to build her argument about her father-in-law's mental confusion. She acted with a cold precision, each step calculated to undermine his self-confidence and validate the need for her intervention. Around 4 o'clock, Lino came out of his room for a glass of water. As he passed through the living room, the loud sound from the television assaulted him. He frowned, confused. He didn't remember leaving the TV on that channel. He looked for the remote on the coffee table where he always left it, but he couldn't find it. He searched the sofa, the floor, feeling a wave of frustration and panic rising. It was a small thing, a lost remote control, but on that day, it felt like definitive proof that his mind was betraying him. Sandra appeared at the living room door, a look of fake concern on her face. Looking for something, father-in-law? The question was pure performance. Lino straightened up, his face red with shame. The remote. I don't know where I put it. Sandra sighed, a theatrical sigh of exhaustion. Oh, Lino, you were just watching it. It must have fallen somewhere. She approached, lifted a cushion, and, like magic, revealed the remote. Here it is. See? You need to rest more. This is why I worry. This is why we need that document. She connected the incident directly to her goal with a skill that bordered on cruelty. Lino was speechless, completely consumed by doubt. Tiago heard the entire exchange from his room. Every word from his mother sounded like a nail being hammered in. He knew his grandfather hadn't turned on the television. He knew this was a trap. The anger he felt was so intense he had to clench his fists to keep from storming out of his room and screaming. His mother wasn't taking care of his grandfather. She was hunting him. She was creating a scenario to justify her actions. The image of his grandfather, a man who had always been so strong and proud, being humiliated in that way was more than he could bear. He needed proof. Something irrefutable. Determined, he waited. He knew his mother usually left her phone charging in the kitchen while she prepared the afternoon coffee. It was a small, risky window of opportunity, but the only one he had. He needed to confirm what was behind the phrase, "solve that thing," which she had mentioned on the phone. His loyalty to his grandfather overcame his fear. He was no longer just a spectator. The injustice he was witnessing had turned him into an investigator, driven by a sense of protection that was stronger than any fear of repercussions. The opportunity arose just as Tiago had predicted. Sandra plugged her phone in to charge on the outlet next to the coffee maker and went out to the yard to collect some clothes from the line, complaining that the weather was turning. Tiago's heart pounded. He got up and went to the kitchen, moving with a silent swiftness. His fingers trembled as he picked up the device. He knew the passcode. It was his father's birthday, a predictable choice. The screen lit up, revealing her recent conversations. He opened the messaging app, his thumb hovering over the chat with his father. What he found was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just about the power of attorney. There were messages exchanged with a real estate agent. "I already have a buyer for your father-in-law's land," one message from the agent said. Sandra's reply was clear. "Great. I just need him to sign the power of attorney so I can close the deal. He's resisting, but I'll get it by the end of the week." The sale of the land that Lino had promised to save for his grandson, for his future studies. The betrayal was twofold. It wasn't to pay bills. It was to take something that wasn't hers. Tiago felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He took pictures of the messages. With his own phone, the camera's click sounding absurdly loud in the kitchen's silence. He locked his mother's device and placed it back on the charger seconds before she walked in through the back door, a laundry basket in her arms. She didn't notice a thing. To her, he was just her teenage son, standing in the kitchen, probably looking for something to eat. He forced a nod and left, his heart hammering against his ribs, the proof burning in his pocket. He locked himself in his room again, sitting on his bed. The images on his phone screen were undeniable. The coldness with which his mother negotiated his grandfather's assets, the way she referred to his resistance as a mere inconvenience to be overcome, this changed everything. It was no longer a matter of mistrust or protecting his grandfather from small humiliations. It was about stopping a theft. The image of his mother, the woman who had raised him, shattered in his mind, replaced by that of a calculating stranger. The pain of the discovery was sharp, but the clarity of what needed to be done was even greater. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Tiago barely touched the food Sandra placed on the table for their afternoon snack. He answered questions with monosyllables, his mind busy planning how and when he would reveal what he knew. He had to wait for his father to arrive. Confronting his mother alone would be useless. She would deny everything, turn him against his father, maybe even break the phone to destroy the evidence. The confrontation had to have maximum impact. It had to happen in front of his father, the only person who could intervene decisively. The wait was torture. Marcos arrived around 6:30, carrying the fatigue of a long workday. He was a good man but passive, one who blindly trusted his wife to manage the house and family life. He came in, gave Sandra a kiss, ruffled Tiago's hair, and went to ask about his father. "He's in his room, resting. It was a tough day for him." "He was very confused," Sandra said, already setting the stage. The lie came out with a naturalness that made Tiago's stomach clench. He watched his father nod, his expression worried, accepting her version without question. Dinner was the stage Sandra chose for her final act. She prepared Lino's favorite dish and called him to the table with renewed kindness. The old man came, shuffling his feet, his face worn down by the day's succession of small assaults on his dignity. He sat down, and the family began to eat in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of silverware. Tiago could barely swallow. He could feel the phone in his pocket, as if it were a heavy, dangerous object. He looked from his grandfather to his mother, then to his father. feeling like an actor in a play about to reach its tragic climax. In the middle of the meal, Sandra put down her silverware. "Marcos, dear," she began, in the calm tone of someone starting a serious conversation. "We need to resolve your father's situation. I tried talking to him today, but he doesn't understand. It's for his own good." She then turned to Lino. "Father-in-law, your son is here now. He also thinks it's for the best." She took the document from the sideboard drawer, along with the pen, and placed it on the table next to Lino's plate. "This is the last time I'm asking. Please, sign. Do it for your family." Marcos looked at his father with an expression of pity. He loved Lino, but he trusted his wife's judgment. If Sandra said it was necessary, then it was. "Dad, Sandra just wants to help. It makes things easier for everyone. It's just a signature." The pressure now came from all sides. Lino looked at his son, then at his daughter-in-law, and finally at the paper. His energy to fight was completely depleted. He felt defeated, cornered by her fabricated concern and his son's blind trust. With a trembling hand, he picked up the pen. The silence in the room was absolute, the expectation hanging in the air. "Don't sign it, Grandpa." Tiago's voice, though not loud, cut through the silence like a blade. Everyone turned to him. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. Sandra shot him a death glare. "Tiago, stay out of this. This is grown-up business." But Tiago didn't back down. He stood up, took the phone from his pocket, and placed it on the table facing his father. "Dad, you need to see this. Mom doesn't want the power of attorney to help Grandpa. She wants it to, sell his land without him knowing." The shock in the room was palpable. Marcos frowned, not understanding. "What are you talking about, Tiago?" Sandra tried to intervene, laughing nervously. "He's been watching too many TV shows, Marcos. It's all in his head." She reached for the phone, but Tiago was faster. "Read it, Dad. Read her conversations with the real estate agent." With his heart pounding, Marcos picked up his son's phone and began to read. The pictures of the messages were clear. With every line he read, the color drained from his face, replaced by a pallor of disbelief and horror. He lifted his eyes from the messages and stared at his wife. Her expression now was not of calm or control, but of panic. The mask had fallen. "Sandra?" he said. His voice choked, a question that carried the weight of years of trust being shattered. She didn't answer, just looked from Marcos to Tiago, desperation stamped on her face. Lino watched everything, the pen forgotten in his hand. The confusion in his mind gave way to a terrible and painful clarity. The fog of doubt that had tormented him all day dissipated, revealing the raw, naked truth. "That's why," Lino whispered, more to himself than to the others. The pieces fell into place. The missing glasses, the TV remote, the insistence, the rush. It wasn't concern. It was greed. He looked at Sandra, not with anger, but with a deep and bitter disappointment. The woman he had welcomed into his home, who shared his meals, was actively trying to rob him, using his old age as a weapon against him. Marcos, in turn, stood up. His voice, when he spoke, was low but laden with a cold fury no one there had ever heard. "You were lying to me. You were deceiving my father." Sandra tried to defend herself, the words tumbling out. "Marcos, I was going to tell you. It was to pay off the debts, to give us some relief. It was for our own good." The justification sounded empty, pathetic. "Our own good?" Marcos repeated, incredulous. "At the expense of his dignity and his property? By walking all over him as if he were nothing?" He pointed at Lino, who remained seated, watching the ruin of his family. The confrontation was no longer about a piece of paper. It was about respect, about character, about betrayal in the most intimate core of their lives. Lino gently placed the pen on the table. He pushed his plate aside and, with a calmness that surprised everyone, folded the power of attorney document in half and then in half again, creasing the paper with his thumb. Each fold was an act of assertion, a gesture of someone taking back control of his own life. He looked at his son, and then at Sandra. There were no longer any traces of the confused and frightened man from hours before. In his place stood the patriarch of the family, the man whose home and whose rules had been violated. "The land stays," he said, his voice firm and clear. "It's Tiago's. It always was." He then turned to Marcos. "And, starting tomorrow, son, I want you to help me find a place of my own. A small apartment nearby. I can still take care of myself, and when I can't, I'll ask for help. I will not be treated like an invalid in my own home. The declaration was a final blow. There were no shouts, no arguments, just the truth, stated simply and definitively, which redrew all the boundaries of that family. Sandra was frozen, speechless. Her plan had disintegrated spectacularly. She was no longer the concerned caregiver, but the unmasked villain. Marcos, his face grim, simply nodded at his father. Yes, sir. First thing tomorrow. He couldn't look at his wife. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. It was the silence of an ending, the sound of a relationship breaking irreparably. Tiago went to his grandfather's side and stood there, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of protection, of alliance. The boy and the old man, together against the injustice that had almost consumed them. The rest of dinner was abandoned. Sandra retreated to the master bedroom, the sound of the closing door the only noise. Marcos sat back down, his head in his hands, lost. Lino, however, seemed lighter. He looked at Tiago, and in his eyes was a gratitude that no words could express. His grandson had not only saved him from a financial scam, he had saved him from himself, from the doubt that was consuming him, giving him back the dignity that had been stolen from him bit by bit, in calculated acts of false concern. Later that night, the house was plunged into a strange quiet. It wasn't peace, but the silence that follows a storm. Marcos and Sandra were locked in their room, and the few words that escaped through the door were tense and low. Lino was sitting in the living room armchair, the same one where he had so often felt confused and helpless throughout the day. But now, he didn't feel that way. He looked at the old photos on the shelf, at his wife's smiling face, and felt that he had honored her memory, that he had not let himself be broken. Tiago appeared with 2 cups of lemon balm tea. He handed one to his grandfather and sat on the rug at his feet, as he used to do when he was little. They didn't need to talk. The day had said it all. The grandfather sipped his tea and the grandson looked at his face, seeing the worry lines finally soften. There was a new strength in Lino, a serenity that came from validation, from having been seen and defended. That simple act of drinking tea together was a ritual of reaffirmation, the silent celebration of a hard-won victory. "You're a good boy, Tiago," Lino said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have your grandmother's heart." The praise, coming at that moment, carried immense weight for Tiago. He felt he had done the right thing, however difficult and painful it had been to expose his own mother. He had protected his grandfather. He had defended the truth. The cost of that action was still uncertain. The dynamic with his parents was in ruins, but looking at his grandfather, he knew he would not regret it. He gave a small smile. "You're the one who taught me not to stay quiet." They sat there for a long time as the night wore on. Lino's decision to move was real, and they both knew that life as they knew it was over. But there was not only sadness in that realization, there was also the promise of a new beginning. For Lino, it was the chance to live his final years with the autonomy he deserved. For Tiago, it was the end of innocence, but the beginning of a deeper understanding of integrity and courage. The bond between them, tested by the fire of that day, had become unbreakable. When Lino finally stood up to go to bed, he leaned on his grandson's shoulder, but this time it wasn't a gesture of frailty. It was a gesture of trust, of partnership. He walked down the hall with his back a little straighter, his head a little higher. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. As he closed his bedroom door, he no longer felt like a prisoner awaiting a sentence, but a free man, the master of his own destiny, thanks to the courage of a boy who refused to look away. Tiago remained in the dark living room, looking out the window. The street was silent. A single day. It seemed impossible that so much had happened in so few hours. The morning had begun with a pending signature and a sense of anguish. The night ended with the truth exposed, and an uncertain, but clean, future. He felt the weight of that day on his shoulders, a weight that had made him grow years in a matter of hours. Nothing would be the same, and he knew it. But as he thought of his grandfather's grateful gaze, he felt a deep peace. That day, with all its pain, had been worth it.